Hello, my name is Kennedy Moore with the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sheyda Jahanbani. Dr. Jahanbani is a professor at the University of Kansas with an emphasis in foreign relations and international history. Dr. Jahanbani will be joining us on campus on February 20th, 2025, from 6 to 7:30 in McCord Auditorium to discuss her new book, The Poverty of the World: Rediscovering the Poor at Home and Abroad, which also won the 2024 CPH Book Prize Award. Congratulations, and thank you, Dr. Jahanbani, for being here with me today.
Thank you so much. And I'm still super amazed every time I hear somebody say that it won this award. I'm like, did I actually write this book? It's so gratifying to be here. And I'm really excited. Today is a snow day here in Kansas. I'm really excited to head south in a week or so.
Perfect. We're so glad to have you. So, the first question I have for you today is I was curious about what even got you interested in this topic. What was the ideation process?
It's a little bit of a long story. So my father and mother were very different ages. So my dad was born in the 1920s in Iran, and my mom was born in the 1960s in North Carolina, or 1940s in North Carolina. And they both had very particular experiences with sort of politics and world events. And I was an only child, and we talked a lot around the dinner table about history and about politics. And, my dad had experienced the Great Depression and World War II and had lots of thoughts about the kind of the ways that those two events had really transformed the world. And he was also from Iran, which was a developing country, and was a nationalist. So he was really part of the sort of decolonization story of the post-1945 period. So that was his perspective. And my mom was from this southern town. She was from a working class family. And so she was very, sort of morally committed. Her parents were to the civil rights movement. They were, white Southerners who actually were some of those white liberals. And so her stories about growing up in the 1960s were about sort of the way in which social movements and especially American liberals had actually been able to kind of make some real progress in terms of democracy in the United States. So we talked a lot about these different kinds of issues. And I became really interested in the way that American politicians after the Second World War really took on an enormous challenge, which is, on multiple fronts, really trying to recreate a world that could both, produce extraordinary wealth, but also produce some measure of meaningful democracy at home and abroad. And so those kinds of questions kept coming up in my own education. Like I just kept gravitating to stories about, for instance, the Johnson administration or the Kennedy administration or Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and the kind of both international politics of all of those administrations, but also the domestic policies. So long story short, I planned a career in politics, and I kind of had a meltdown moment in the early 2000s where I was just like, I don't really think this is I don't think this is my thing yet. I was disappointed in some political figures that I'd worked for, and I just felt that we didn't really understand enough about what it meant to fight for social justice within political institutions. That kind of knowledge had been sort of lost in the 1990s. And so I went to my favorite college professor, who was a history professor, and I said, like, what should I do with my life? Because I kind of had this plan, and I was like really on the path to that plan. And he said, you should go get a PhD in history. And he made it sound very easy, which of course it was not. And he was like, you'll be great at it. You should do it. You got these great questions. So that's what you should do. So even though I stumbled a lot, I did actually wind up developing a set of skills and a research agenda that was really focused on the same questions that I talked about with my parents around the dinner table. So sort of American power and, the way in which the United States sought to, at least in words, spread democratic values in the post-war period. And I developed in graduate school, a research question specifically about the war on poverty that was really about whether the war on poverty, like there's this sort of longstanding historical question about why the war on poverty happened at all, like when it did, because it was actually a period of extraordinary abundance and pretty widespread abundance in the United States. The post-war boom and the rise of labor unions during the war and the Depression had led to really more equitable distribution of that wealth than ever before. So there's kind of an odd thing, like why did Americans become so obsessed with the question of poverty? And I tried to put that question into the context of America's global mission as well as domestic politics. And so that was the research question at the heart of what became my dissertation. And then after many years, because the project kept growing and growing and growing, and finally wound up turning into like a revisionist history of post-1945 liberalism.
What are your thoughts about the changes of U.S. foreign policy, especially with the current like retrenchment of major like welfare and international development agencies like the USAID? Also, particularly in the context of like Cold War post like commitments to combating poverty.
Yeah, so I mean, there's so much there. I think I will say, what was it last week? I've been trying, like many feminists with children who are trying to manage our intake of information in this current moment. I have been really good about only reading the news once a week. That's been my practice since January. And the USAID news found me, though. It found me because I'm part of a collective, basically, of historians of international development who we all started kind of texting each other, like, what the hell? We've been critiquing this agency for our entire academic careers, but we never really expected anybody to just shutter it. So I think that moment actually was a fascinating one in terms of the story that I'm interested in the book. One of the things I argue is that American liberals in particular identified poverty as a kind of mission that the United States could address in its, could use its post-war power to address, and that would be a way to both demonstrate that American power was different. It was not self-interested, and again, I see all of the complexities and problems with what I'm saying here, but I'm interested in the way that historical actors thought about it. And also how it was different from what the Soviet Union was offering. So there's that Cold War context. And the extent to which the fight against poverty, located in the government, because lots of civil society organizations took on this fight. And, the UN became resurgent on this issue in the 70s and then again in the 90s. So it's not that people didn't work to solve the problem of global poverty, but the American government, definitely retrenched from that mission in the late 1960s. And I think partly that was a kind of acknowledgement that vision of U.S. empire was not, going to be viable anymore. And I think people in the government gave up. And I think especially the most powerful, advocates for this vision of U.S. empire, liberals within the Democratic Party, basically gave up. And so it's kind of I think a sort of tragic story that I tell in the book, but one that, I think is really interesting right now as we look for voices defending USAID, and defending the mission of the United States in fighting poverty abroad. I've been noticing, as I've been paying attention over the last week, just a lot of echoes of the language of what the role of the United States should be in making its own affluence more available to people around the world for its own self-interest, right? To promote democratic values, to fight all sorts of global problems that, of course, affect the United States just as they affect other countries. So I think the way that the story that I tell in the book helps me understand the present is it sort of confirmed for me how potent of kind of idea poverty fighting was for American liberals, and how we've kind of forgotten how to talk about that, and really ceded the territory to people who maybe don't believe that the United States should have a role in the world really of leadership at all, let alone in this particular area.
That feeds right into my next question. You were talking about Gunnar Myrdal and his like shift from observing the correlation of race to poverty within the US South to this overarching pinnacle problem of global poverty. And for me, that kind of resonated because, especially in the West, we view a lot of the third world countries as like destitute, yet they're primarily minorities and they're extremely rich in resources that we then go over and like plunder and take from them as global superpowers. So I wanted to know from you, this increasing non-interventionist or isolationist like philosophy that the US is adapting, like where's that coming from? And how does the mission of combating global poverty change because of this?
Well, okay, let's start with the sort of moment where I end the book, which is, what I think of as the sort of end of this big vision of what I call an empire of affluence, this notion of what American empire could look like other than just a strategic empire. So, in the late 1960s, you had all these young people, as I write about in the book, who were empowered by war on poverty programs, both at home and abroad, to become really interested in international development and in poverty fighting more broadly. And they don't just disappear because the US government steps back from funding those efforts. In fact, lots of Peace Corps volunteers and Vista volunteers go on to found NGOs that in the 1970s wind up taking the lead on foreign aid and development programs. So one of the things I think is an important continuity is that like there's a whole generation of people for whom fighting global poverty was like a central mission and like a core sense of their notion of what it meant to be an American. And when the US government decided to kind of leave the field, they found ways to continue working on that project. Now, by the 1980s and 90s, the US government winds up hiring those NGOs to the contracts work out, basically. The development work that USAID does, a lot of it is contracted out to those very organizations. So I think there's kind of a rich irony there that you have like people who were, these young, energetic people who were hired by the government to represent the United States. And when the United States sort of gives up on this mission, they keep doing the work and yet wind up being hired to do this work by the government. And the way in which that kind of suggests, I think, the hollowing out of this imperial vision. Instead it becomes sort of much more transactional and kind of technocratic and bureaucratic, if you like. So I think that's one thing that like is happening right now. But to go back to your original question about race, because that was the key thing I want to make sure I talk about.
Yeah, so I was talking about how Gunnar Myrdal had his like continuity of
Yeah,
thought
yeah.
that got to the global poverty and how like most of the third world countries that we deem as like destitute are the ones that are primarily like say like an African country that is like, oh, that's third world country, they don't need anything, but we go and like take coltan for our phones or our computers from them.
Right.
And they like live in very corrupt governments and societies that could be very prosperous, but are not and suffering in poverty. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of our I think you also asked about the impulse for isolationism, right? Like where is this coming from?
Yeah.
I think that, and why I wanted to talk about kind of what happens after 1968 is I think the United States government, like leaders, especially in the Democratic Party, who had been, I think, the architects of this vision of poverty fighting as a major element of the national mission, they sort of give up, but the work continues just in different manifestations. And so one of the things that I think we're seeing now is a kind of a resurgence almost of a notion of, the limits of reform, if you want to call it that. I mean, I think that, I'm not trying to be polemical, but there's a very strong white supremacist element to our current foreign policy making, body, if you like, in the executive branch. And it seems to me that part of what we're seeing is like this is also a generation of people who lived through the failure of the war on poverty. And so, I think somebody like our current president really imbibed Ronald Reagan's line, that the government fought a war on poverty and poverty won. So I think there's that, right? A sense that this is not something that the United States can do. Ironically, I think it has a lot like to do with a lack of faith in the potential of the United States to change the world, which is the rich irony because it's all about making America great. But, I think more broadly, there's just not a constituency fighting for a robust and compassionate U.S. foreign policy. And I think this is something, sorry, this is a cat cameo. Um, this is something that I think I'll be very honest and say, my politics um, lean towards the left, and I am staggered by how little foreign policy thinking there is on the left that is not just sort of critiquing things that the US government has done over the years, but actually trying to generate new ideas about what, for instance, a new global war on poverty could be. So I think on one side, there's a great deal of kind of, just a sort of notion that like nothing can change. This is not the United States' mission. It can't make anything better. And that comes from a wellspring of kind of racism and also a vision of what American power is, and maybe also a faith or lack of faith in democracy itself.
Yeah.
And, on the other side, I don't think there's really the same kind of thinking and creative problem solving that the people whose stories I tell in the book were willing to engage in. I mean, part of like what I was drawn to about this story is flawed though their results were, and, problematic though many of their ideas were, I do think that the actors that I write about in my book were genuinely interested in trying to find solutions to the problem of global poverty. And that they believed very much in knowledge. Myrdal is a perfect example of this. He was the iconic social scientist who believed that we could solve big problems, humans, if we applied enough thought and research. And I mean, the fact that he took on, white supremacy with his first project and then global poverty with the latter projects in his life, I think reveals that. And just that kind of creativity and sense of possibility is, I guess, what I mourn in our own moment, because I do think that the opposite is actually very strong right now, a kind of nefarious anti-humanism on one end, and then a kind of apathy or sense of just failure on the other.
You wrote that economic inequality bred social disorder, and social disorder threatened the democratic political order. I would love to know more behind that, like just phrase, because it just like sounded so good to me. I was like, wait, she's like, that was perfect. But on like a larger, more analytical question, we live in a representative democracy with a capitalist society that inherently relies on disparities between like the haves and the have-nots. So this is kind of personal, but like, do you think it's possible to abolish poverty within a capitalist framework? And what structural changes or alternatives would be necessary to like make the vision of like Myrtle's like abolishment of poverty exist and become a reality?
That's a big question. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, let me start with that line. So one of the things, that when you're writing a piece of historical scholarship, you rely enormously on the scholarship that other people have produced to like give you this, especially when you're doing intellectual history. It's like, at some point you're just, my spouse is also an intellectual historian. He says it's like trying to nail Jello to a wall. Like you're like, but what about, what's the origin of this idea? And every time you ask that question, you're just unpeeling more layers. And it's like, well, now I'm just like back to, the 10 Commandments, like cuneiform. So all to say, that one of the things that I was surprised by when I was doing this book is there was a sort of conventional wisdom that economic instability led to violence and disorder. And that's like a very commonplace notion today, right? When we think about like, USAID is a perfect example. I know my own knee-jerk reaction was like, but USAID does all this stuff to prevent, extreme poverty. And there has been progress made on that in the last couple of decades. And these are exactly the places where terrorism and, other forms of violence emerge, right? So this is a very common notion that we have about the relationship between poverty and violence. And when I was researching the book, I found it so interesting. Like that was just assumed by all my historical actors. So I was like, where'd they get that from? Somebody surely has written about this. And there actually really wasn't much on that kind of core idea. You know, Marx came up a lot, right? Because of this
Yeah.
sort of notion of poverty or immiseration and alienation and revolution. But you know, where'd Marx get that idea from? So, you know, hence another like 4 years of research. So part of what, you know, was interesting to me is the way that that has become a conventional wisdom. I think it's borne out by, you know, the historical record. Um, I I don't know. So I really sympathize, and certainly before I did a lot of history of capitalism, which is one of the things I'm currently just this semester even teaching. You know, I definitely assumed that there was like not a way for capitalism to really provide the most just, uh, like distribution of goods for humanity to thrive, especially when we think about its environmental toll. And I guess over the years, doing a lot of economic history and reading a lot of economists, one of the things that strikes me is, you know, I don't think I fully appreciated when I was in college the way that industrial capitalism solved one of the most enormous problems that human beings had ever, you know, had confronted in their entire history, which was the problem of how to produce enough stuff. It didn't solve the distribution problem, right? How do you make sure everybody gets enough stuff? But the basic problem of how do you literally produce enough stuff so we don't have to, you know, basically be only like producing to the Malthusian standard. Like John Maynard Keynes, the founder of macroeconomics, is kind of the first one who in 1930, in the depths of the Depression, writes this little essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which he's like, guys, we got this. It's going to be okay. All we have to do is figure out how to distribute this stuff and figure out how to manage the crises that capitalism also creates. But if we think in terms of, you know, the best outcome for humanity, capitalism actually has a lot to offer. And that's the same, you know, philosophy that the people I write about in the book shared. And so I think if I'm really pushed to a conclusion, I think that capitalism is endlessly adaptable. And while inequality has been a feature of capitalism, inequality has also been a feature of the systems that existed before capitalism.
For sure.
So I think the extent to which capitalism can adapt and can create opportunity, as much as I am, you know, grievously dismayed by our current state of affairs and by the persistent and disgusting, frankly, inequalities, both in the United States and between the United States and other societies. I do think that the basic framework of capitalist thinking could be our way through. And certainly thinking about sustainability, for instance, you know, does capitalism have to be unsustainable? I maybe this is just because for the purposes of this class, I've been reading a lot of Keynes, and he really thought capitalism could kind of flex and stretch to do anything as long as the human beings who were controlling this system actually had good intentions. So I guess I'm feeling weirdly a little bit more optimistic than I maybe might have been 6 months ago, just because I've been so immersed in all this stuff from the 1930s. But I do think it takes political economic thinking and action and organizing, right? It's not just, you know, I don't think like the neoliberal version of capitalism is it. I think that was one iteration. And I think social democracy is another iteration. And that, you know, we can find ways to improve human experience on the planet. And we like economics has to be a part of that. How we produce enough stuff to all live is a key part of it, right?
So if you had to pitch your lecture to maybe a finance or trumpet performance major, just someone that's not typically interested in history, what would be the one thing you would say to them to have them sit down for an hour and listen to your lecture?
Ooh, I do love this question. Okay, and I think I can do this in a quick answer. At the heart of the story I'm telling are a group of people who all kind of came together to solve a problem. They tried to figure out a problem, they tried to diagnose it, and then they tried to come up with solutions for it. And even though it's a history book and I'm a historian, I think there's a lot of human drama in watching people think. You know, this is sort of what makes us human beings, is looking at the world around us and trying to figure out how to improve upon this, whether it's, our ancient ancestors with a tool, or whether it's us with thinking about, like, how do we build a car that doesn't use fossil fuels? Like, this spirit of invention and creativity and experimentation is sort of an essential human quality. And I sort of find myself amazed that in the middle of the 20th century, a bunch of, very realistic intellectuals and policymakers sat around saying, this poverty thing that has bedeviled humanity since the dawn of time, like, let's figure this out. So I think there's a lot of human drama in watching people try to solve problems. And there's not a single discipline, whether it's art or theater or business or supply chain management, where the basic intellectual work is not trying to figure something out and take it apart and put it back together and see what that process reveals to us. So I think that's what the book is about, even though it's like got a lot of footnotes.
Well, thank you so much for meeting with me today. For all the people listening, come to McCord Auditorium on February 20th from 6 to 7:30 to hear from Dr. Jahanbani in person.
I'm so
Thank
excited to
you.
be there. And thank you for your time, Kennedy.
Of course. Thank you so much.